December 23, 1846. Skibbereen, County Cork, Ireland. When Quaker relief worker William Forster entered the stone cottage on Bridge Street, he expected to find the Murphy family deceased from starvation. What he discovered instead would haunt him for the remainder of his days. His golden retriever, Barley, a dog he'd brought from Yorkshire specifically to provide comfort to dying children, was crouched in the corner of the dark room. The animal's muzzle was stained dark. Year-old golden retriever, bred from Scottish hunting stock. Forster had acquired the dog in 1843, and the animal had become his constant companion. The decision to bring Barley to Ireland was deliberate. Forster had read reports of children in the afflicted areas becoming psychologically withdrawn, traumatized by watching their siblings die. He believed a gentle dog might provide some small comfort, might coax a smile from a dying child, might restore some fragment of innocence to those who had seen too much. It was, by all accounts, an act of profound compassion. The Skibbereen to which Forster and Barley arrived in December 1846 defied comprehension. The town's workhouse, designed to hold 800 people, contained over 1,200. The fever hospital was overwhelmed. Mass graves were being dug in Abbey Strewery Cemetery, not individual graves, but trenches into which dozens of bodies were placed without coffins, often without names. Dr. Daniel Donovan, the local physician, estimated that 100 people were dying per day in the Skibbereen area alone. His description of conditions at the workhouse is clinical in its horror. The inmates were crowded together like pigs in a sty, many of them in a state of nudity. The dead were lying in the same room with the living and even in the same bed. The streets themselves had become hazardous. Buildings stood abandoned, their occupants either dead inside or fled to the workhouse. The smell of decomposition hung in the winter air. At night, feral dogs and pigs roamed freely, and there were whispered reports of what they were feeding upon. This was the world into which William Forster brought his beloved retriever, hoping to bring comfort to dying children. Within 2 weeks, that decision would transform into his greatest regret. December 8, 1846, the first incident. Forster's journal entry from that evening is matter of fact. Barley exhibited unusual reluctance to enter the Mahoney residence on North Street. The dog planted himself at the threshold and emitted a low whine of distress, most peculiar, as he has previously shown no fear of entering even the most deplorable dwellings. Inside the Mahoney home, Forster found Patrick Mahoney deceased, his wife Catherine near death, and 3 children in various stages of fever. The scene was tragically typical. What wasn't typical was Barley's behavior. Even after Forster had arranged for the family to be transported to the fever hospital, the dog refused to cross the threshold. It took physical coaxing to get the animal to move. That night, Barley refused his food. Forster attributed this to the distressing sights and smells the dog had encountered. December 11, 1846. The second incident. Forster was conducting rounds in the area known as Gallows Hill, one of the worst affected districts. Here, families too weak to reach the workhouse simply remained in their cabins waiting to die. The protocol was grim: check for survivors, arrange transportation for those who could be moved, record the names of the deceased for later burial. At one cabin, Forster found the door barred from inside. This sometimes happened, families securing themselves against the feral animals that roamed at night. He called out. No response. He forced the door. Inside were 4 bodies. The O'Sullivan family, parents and 2 children. They had been dead for perhaps 3 days, Forster estimated. The cabin was freezing, which had slowed decomposition, but the smell was still overwhelming. Barley entered the cabin without hesitation this time. While Forster recorded the names and details in his journal, the dog moved about the small space, sniffing. Then Barley did something that made Forster pause. The dog began licking the floor near the mother's bed. "Barley, here," Forster commanded. The dog ignored him, continuing to lick at the earthen floor with what Forster described as disturbing intensity. When Forster physically pulled the dog away, he noticed the animal's bria. Thing had changed. Rapid, shallow pants despite the cold temperature. Barley's eyes seemed unfocused. Outside, the dog vomited. Forster assumed the animal had ingested something toxic from the contaminated floor. But that night, for the first time, Barley attempted to leave Forster's lodgings. The animal scratched at the door continuously from midnight until 3 in the morning, whining and pacing. When Forster finally opened the door to see what was causing such distress, Barley bolted into the darkness. It took Forster 20 minutes to locate the dog. Barley was 3 streets away, outside a cottage that Forster knew to be abandoned. The animal was pawing at the door, utterly fixated. "It was as though he could smell something I could not," Forster wrote. some scent that called to him with irresistible urgency. When Forster investigated the cottage the following morning, he found it contained 2 bodies, a mother and infant who had died sometime in the previous week, December 15, 1846, the third incident. By this point, Forster had begun to notice changes in Barley's appearance. The dog had lost weight despite being fed regularly. Its coat, once lustrous gold, had become dull and matted. Most disturbing were the eyes. The warm, attentive gaze that Forster knew so well had been replaced by something harder, more distant. Other relief workers had begun to comment on the dog's behavior. James Hack Tuke, another Quaker volunteer, noted in his own journal, "Forster's retriever has become quite altered in temperament. The animal that once sought affection now shrinks from touch. It watches us at meals with an intensity that borders on aggression." On December 15th, Forster and Tuke were distributing rations in the townland of Cara, about 5 miles from Skibbereen proper. The conditions here were somehow even worse than in the town itself. Entire families had died in their homes, and no one remained alive to report the deaths. At one cabin they found the Driscoll family, 7 people in total, all deceased. The scene was unremarkable by the horrific standards of that winter. Bodies in beds, clear evidence of prolonged starvation, the familiar green staining around mouths from eating grass and weeds in the final desperate days. Barley entered this cabin with what Forster described as unseemly eagerness. While the 2 men were outside, discussing whether to arrange for immediate burial or simply record the location for the mass grave crew, they heard a sound from inside the cabin, a tearing sound. When they rushed back inside, they found Barley in the corner with the body of the youngest Driscoll child, a girl of perhaps 6 years. The dog had torn open the child's burial shroud, a thin cloth that family members had managed to wrap the body in before succumbing themselves. The dog's teeth were bared, Forster wrote, his handwriting notably shaken on this journal page, not in aggression toward us, but in some kind of concentration, as though he were about to. Forster couldn't complete the thought in his journal, but Tuke's account fills in the gap. "We both realized in the same horrible instant what the animal intended. Forster struck the dog with his walking stick, the only time I ever saw him raise a hand to the creature. Barley yelped and retreated, but the look in the animal's eyes, there was no remorse there, only frustration at being interrupted." They secured Barley outside and completed their grim documentation in silence. That evening, Forster wrote a letter to the Central Relief Committee requesting permission to return to England. He made no mention of Barley's behavior, citing only the overwhelming nature of the suffering he was witnessing. The request was denied. Too few volunteers were willing to work in Skibbereen. He was needed. December 19, 1846. Ossery shop. The dog had stopped eating the food Forster provided. In 4 days, it had touched nothing, not the dried meat, not the bread, not even the bones Forster procured from the soup kitchen. The animal should have been weakening from starvation. Instead, Barley appeared alert, even energized. It paced constantly, wearing a path in the wooden floor. At night, the scratching at the door intensified. Mrs. Bridget Crowley, Forster's landlady, complained about the noise. More than that, she complained about the dog's presence. "That animal has the devil in it now," she told Forster. "I've seen dogs go bad before, but never like this. It doesn't see you anymore when it looks at you. It sees through you." On the night of December 19th, Barley escaped. Forster had secured the dog before leaving to attend an evening meeting at the Relief Committee's temporary headquarters. When he returned 2 hours later, the rope had been chewed through. The door remained closed. Mrs. Crowley swore she had heard nothing, seen nothing. But Barley was gone. Forster searched through the night. The winter darkness of Skibbereen was absolute, broken only by the occasional lamp in a window where someone still had oil to burn. He called Barley's name until his voice grew hoarse. Nothing. At dawn, he found the dog. Barley was inside the Bridgeview cottage, a structure that housed multiple families, most of whom had already perished. Forster had documented deaths at this location 3 days earlier. He knew at least 9 bodies remained inside, awaiting the burial crew. The cottage door stood ajar. Forster entered. The smell struck him first, not just the sweet rot of decomposition that he had become grimly accustomed to, but something else, something disturbed and raw. Barley was in the back room, where the Sheehan family had died. The dog's muzzle was buried in. Forster's journal entry breaks off. The next line, written in different ink, possibly added days later, simply reads, "I cannot." But we know what Forster saw because of what he told Father Timothy Traynor, the local Catholic priest who later provided testimony to authorities. According to Father Traynor, Forster arrived at the presbytery at approximately 7 in the morning, in a state of profound distress, weeping openly. Forster described finding Barley feeding on the corpse of Catherine Sheehan, who had died of fever 4 days earlier. The dog had torn through the woman's abdomen and was consuming the soft tissues. When Forster entered, Barley had looked up at him, not with guilt or fear, but with what Forster described as territorial awareness, as though I were intruding on its rightful kill. He asked me if a dog could be possessed, Father Trainer later testified. He asked me if an animal could be driven mad not by hunger, but by developing an appetite for something it was never meant to eat. He asked me if damnation extended to beasts. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. This is one of the most disturbing tales we've uncovered in our research, and only gets darker from here. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries from history. And let's discover what happens next in the final days of Barley's descent into madness. December 23, 1846. The day everything unraveled. After the incident at Bridgeview Cottage, Forster had managed to recapture Barley and confine the animal in a storage shed behind his lodgings. The dog was secured with chains this time, chains meant for farm animals. Mrs. Crowley had helped him, though she'd insisted he pay for additional locks and informed him the dog could not remain much longer. For 3 days, Barley had been imprisoned in that shed. Forster brought food and water, which the dog ignored. The animal no longer barked or whined. It simply watched Forster with those changed eyes whenever he opened the door. On December 23rd, Forster received a report that the Murphy family on Bridge Street required immediate assay. S meant neighbors had heard nothing from the residents in over a week and feared the worst. The Murphy family consisted of Seamus Murphy, his wife Mary, and their 4 children ranging from 14 years to 6 months of age. They were weavers, or had been, before the famine collapsed the market for their trade. By December, they were destitute. Forster approached the stone cottage at approximately 2 in the afternoon. The door was closed but not locked. This was common. Locks were pointless when you owned nothing worth stealing. He knocked. No response. He entered. The cottage's front room was empty, a cold hearth, a loom that would never be used again. The smell of sickness and death, familiar now. The family was in the back room, their sleeping quarters. Forster's initial assessment was that all 6 family members were deceased. They lay in their beds, bodies skeletal, the familiar tableau of starvation he had documented dozens of times before. Then he noticed the movement in the corner. Barley raised his head and looked at Forster. The dog should have been in the locked shed behind Forster's lodgings 3 streets away. The impossibility of it froze me in place, Forster wrote. I had secured that shed myself. I had tested the locks. Yet here was my dog, my companion, my own Barley in this chamber of death, and I knew with terrible certainty that I had not brought him here. The dog's muzzle was stained dark. In the dim light filtering through the cottage's single small window, Forster could see something in Barley's mouth. He approached slowly, speaking softly. Barley, good boy, come here, boy. The dog didn't move, didn't respond to its name. It was only when Forster got closer that he saw the youngest Murphy child, an infant girl named Bridget, according to parish records. She lay in a small cot near her mother's bed. Her left hand was missing. The removal was not clean, not surgical. It was torn, ragged. The small arm ended in exposed bone and tissue. Forster looked at what Barley was chewing. He later testified that he screamed. Mrs. Crowley, 3 houses away, would confirm hearing a sound of absolute anguish unlike any she had heard even in that season of suffering. But there was more. When Forster examined the other bodies, he found evidence that Barley had been feeding for some time. Thomas Murphy, age 9, showed damage to his right leg. Mary Murphy's left foot bore marks of teeth. The pattern was consistent. The dog was targeting extremities, areas where the flesh was accessible. Here's what made the discovery particularly horrifying. Most of the Murphy family had not died of starvation. Dr. Daniel Donovan was summoned immediately. His examination revealed that Seamus, Mary, and the 2 middle children had died of typhus fever within the previous week. The 2 youngest children, however, told a different story. 7-year-old Nora Murphy and the infant Bridget had died more recently, much more recently. Dr. Donovan's report, filed with the Skibbereen Relief Committee and later submitted to the Cork County coroner, concluded that both youngest children had still been alive, though severely weakened, when Barley had gained entry to the cottage. The infant Bridget showed signs of trauma consistent with being attacked while living. The removal of her hand had occurred while blood still pumped through her veins. Nora Murphy, the 7-year-old, presented even more disturbing evidence. Her body was found beneath her bed, where she had apparently tried to hide. Defensive wounds on her remaining arm suggested she had attempted to protect herself. The time of death was estimated at between 12 and 24 hours before Forster's discovery, which meant Barley had been in that cottage with the dying and the dead for at least a full day. Had been feeding for at least a full day. Forster's testimony to the coroner provides the most detailed account of the moment of discovery. I looked at this animal, this creature I had raised from a puppy that had slept at the foot of my bed, that had brought me slippers and fetched game on hunting expeditions, that I had brought to Ireland specifically to bring comfort to suffering children, and I saw something I can only describe as transformed. This was not my Barley. This was not even a dog in any meaningful sense. This was appetite given form. This was hunger that had evolved beyond hunger into something darker, an addiction, a compulsion. He continued, the worst part was not the blood, not the evidence of what had been consumed. The worst part was the recognition. When Barley finally looked at me, truly looked at me, there was a moment where I saw my companion again, saw the dog I loved, and in that flicker of recognition I saw something else, misery. The animal knew what it had become, knew what it was doing, and could not stop itself. Forster stood in that cottage for what he estimated was 10 minutes, though he couldn't be certain. Time had lost meaning. Finally, he managed to move. He backed slowly out of the room, never breaking eye contact with the dog, and dying. It demonstrated what appeared to be purposeful behavior. Father Traynor offered a different perspective during his Sunday sermon on December 27th. According to parish records, he spoke of how suffering of such magnitude creates spiritual wounds in all creatures, not just humans. He suggested that Barley had been broken by bearing witness to death beyond the capacity of an animal's comprehension. William Forster said nothing publicly. He had stopped attending relief committee meetings. Mrs. Crowley reported that he spent most of his time in his room writing letters that he then burned in the hearth. On December 26th, he sent a telegram to the Friends Central Relief Committee in Dublin, cannot continue, stop, request immediate relief, stop Forster. The response came the following day, understood, stop, replacement arriving, stop, remain until January 20, stop. Meanwhile, the investigation into the Murphy family deaths created complications that authorities had not anticipated. The question of culpability was complex. Under Irish law, if a domesticated animal caused injury or death, the owner bore legal responsibility. But what constituted causing death in this instance? The constabulary's initial report stated that the Murphy children had died of disease and starvation with post-mortem interference by an animal. Dr. Donovan disputed this conclusion. His more detailed autopsy report, completed on December 29th, was explicit. The infant Bridget Murphy bears injuries consistent with attack by a large dog while circulation was still functional. The nature and extent of tissue removal could not have occurred without significant blood loss, which would have hastened death. Therefore, the animal must be considered a contributing factor in the child's demise. Regarding 7-year-old Nora Murphy, Dr. Donovan was even more direct. This child died of exsanguination resulting from traumatic amputation of the right hand and partial consumption of tissue from the right leg. The presence of defensive wounds indicates the child was conscious during the attack. While the child was severely weakened by typhus and malnutrition, death would not have occurred at that specific time without the animal's intervention. This is homicide by dog. The legal implications were staggering. If Barley had indeed killed the Murphy children, then William Forster, as the dog's owner, could potentially be charged with manslaughter through negligence. The Skibbereen Relief Committee moved quickly to suppress this interpretation. In a letter to the Cork County coroner dated December 30th, committee chairman Jonathan Pym argued, to criminalize Mr. Forster's actions would be to criminalize all relief work in this desperate region. Mr. Forster brought the animal to Ireland with the purest of intentions, to provide comfort to dying children. That this same animal became disordered by exposure to unprecedented death is a tragedy, but not a crime. If we prosecute relief workers for unforeseeable consequences, we will have no relief workers. The coroner, William Lyons, reached a compromise in his official finding dated January 3, 1847. The Murphy children died of fever and starvation with contributing complications. No specific mention of the dog, no criminal charges recommended. But the matter wasn't finished. On December 31, 1846, Barley killed again. The victim was Owen Driscoll, a 13-year-old boy who had been living rough in an abandoned cart shed on the outskirts of Skibbereen. The boy was an orphan, both parents had died in November, and had been surviving on scraps from the soup kitchen. A laborer discovered the body on the morning of January 1, 1847. The scene was horrific. Unlike the Murphy children, who had been weakened by disease, Owen Driscoll had been relatively healthy. The attack had been prolonged and violent. This time, witnesses had heard the incident. 2 men sleeping in a nearby barn reported hearing terrible reaming around midnight on December 31st. They had assumed it was another death from the famine, screaming was not uncommon, and had not investigated. The detail that confirmed Barley's involvement: golden retriever fur was found clutched in the boy's left hand. Constable Flynn issued a formal order on January 1st. The dog was to be destroyed on sight. Any man who encountered the animal was authorized to kill it by whatever means available. The community responded with a determination that bordered on obsession. Hunting parties formed. Men who had barely enough strength to walk volunteered to search. It was as though killing this one dog could somehow balance the scales against all the death they were powerless to prevent. William Forster participated in the search. Multiple witnesses reported seeing him in the streets at all hours, calling Barley's name. Unlike the organized hunting parties, Forster searched alone and appeared to be unarmed. Mrs. Crowley later testified, "He wasn't trying to kill the dog, he was trying to find it, trying to, make peace with it, understand it." Mr. Forster had this look like a man who'd lost his faith, not in God but in his own judgment, in his ability to know what was right. The end came on January 4th, 1847, a group of men searching the area around the Bridge Street cottage, the original Murphy residence, heard barking from inside. When they entered, they found Barley in the back room, in the exact corner where Forster had first discovered him. The dog was emaciated now. The golden coat was matted with filth and blood. The animal was clearly dying, but from what, the men couldn't determine. There was no visible injury. When the men approached with clubs and knives, Barley didn't flee or attack. The dog simply watched them with those changed eyes. One of the men, a farmer named Patrick O'Neill, later provided testimony. "It was the strangest thing. The dog looked at us, and then it looked toward the door like it was expecting someone. Then it laid down. Just laid down like it had been waiting for permission to stop." The men beat the dog to death. It took several minutes. Barley did not fight back. They burned the body in the cottage's hearth, afraid that even in death the animal might spread some contamination. William Forster was not present for the killing. He had already departed Skibbereen. On January 2nd, his replacement had arrived, a Quaker volunteer named William Bennett. Forster briefed him for exactly 47 minutes. Bennett's journal provides the precise timing, and then left on the mail coach to Cork City. From there he traveled to Dublin and then took a ship back to England. Forster never returned to Ireland. The Skibbereen Relief Committee's final report on the incident, dated January 15, 1847, is deliberately vague. An unfortunate incident involving a domestic animal belonging to volunteer William Forster resulted in several complications to relief work. The animal was destroyed on January 4th. Mr. Forster has returned to England. The matter is closed. But the matter was not closed. Not for the people of Skibbereen, and certainly not for William Forster. In the months that followed, details of what became known as the Quaker's mad dog spread throughout Ireland and eventually to England. The story was picked up by newspapers, though the facts became distorted in the retelling. Some versions claimed Barley had killed dozens. Others suggested the dog had been rabid. A few accounts hinted at supernatural causes. The Society of Friends conducted an internal review. While they found no legal wrongdoing on Forster's part, the Central Relief Committee quietly implemented new policies. No more animals were to accompany relief workers to famine areas. William Forster himself largely disappeared from public life. He continued his work in the woolen trade, but withdrew from Quaker relief activities. His journals from the Ireland mission were donated to the FRI.'s library in London, but with the specific December 1846 entries removed. Those pages weren't rediscovered until 1923, when they were found among Forster's personal effects after his death. The rediscovered journal entries revealed a man consumed by guilt and philosophical questions. In one passage written months after returning to England, Forster wrote, "I brought Barley to Ireland to provide comfort. I believed a gentle animal might remind dying children of innocence, of life before suffering. Instead, I brought a creature whose nature, whose very essence, was transformed by exposure to death on a scale neither of us were meant to witness." People ask me if I blame the dog. I do not. I blame myself for my presumption in believing that any living thing, no matter how pure its origin, could be exposed to such horror and emerge unchanged. Barley was not evil. Barley was broken. And I am the one who brought him to the place that broke him. The Murphy family cottage on Bridge Street stood empty for years after the famine. Local residents avoided it. In 1852, it was finally torn down. According to local tradition, no building has ever been successfully erected on that site, though historical records show this is not strictly true. Various structures occupied the lot over the years, but none remained long. The infant Bridget Murphy was buried in Abbey Strury Cemetery in one of the mass famine graves. Her name appears in the parish death register. Bridget Murphy, aged 6 months, died December 22, 1846, fever and complications. The 7-year-old Nora Murphy is listed separately. Nora Murphy, aged 7 years, died December 22, 1846, fever. No mention of complications. No mention of a dog. Owen Driscoll, the 13-year-old killed on New Year's Eve, is recorded simply as Owen Driscoll, aged 13 years, died December 31, 1846. The official records are silent about what really happened. The truth exists only in journals, letters, and testimony that most people never read. The case of Barley the retriever represents something larger than the tragedy of one animal gone mad, or even the deaths of 3 children in the midst of a famine that killed over 1 million people. It represents a collision between Victorian ideals of civilization and the reality of humanitarian catastrophe on a scale that shattered those ideals. William Forster embodied the best intentions of his era's charitable impulse. He genuinely believed that British middle-class values, kindness, gentleness, the civilizing influence of education and proper care, could ameliorate even the worst suffering. The decision to bring a dog to comfort dying children reflected this worldview, that the presence of a well-bred, gentle animal could remind people of their humanity even as they starved. What Forster encountered in Skibbereen destroyed that belief system. The Great Hunger was not a natural disaster. It was the result of specific political and economic choices. The potato blight was a natural phenomenon, yes, but the mass death resulted from the British government's laissez-faire economic policies, the continuation of food exports from Ireland even as people starved, and the relief programs that were deliberately inadequate. Into this manufactured hell, Forster brought an animal that represented domestic order and civilization. What happened to Barley was a physical manifestation of what was happening to Ireland itself, the systematic destruction of the natural order. Dr. Donovan's clinical analysis was partially correct. Barley's behavior could be explained through veterinary science. Dogs exposed to large quantities of human remains could develop abnormal feeding behaviors. But this explanation, while factually accurate, misses the larger psychological horror. Barley's transformation was not instantaneous. The dog didn't immediately become a monster upon arriving in Skibbereen. Instead, there was a progressive degradation. First, reluctance to enter cottages. Then, traction to the dead. Then, inability to eat normal food. Finally, active predation on the dying. This progression mirrors the psychological trajectory documented in human survivors of the famine. Testimony from the period describes people going through stages of response, initial horror, then gradual normalization of the unthinkable, then complete psychological transformation. Father Michael Collins, a priest who worked in Skibbereen during the worst months, wrote in 1849, "The mind protects itself from sustained horror by degrees. First, you cannot believe what you are seeing. Then you can believe it but cannot accept it. Then you accept it but feel you will never recover. Finally, you no longer feel at all. You simply document and move forward. You become a different person, capable of functioning in hell because you have ceased to be the person who would have been destroyed by hell." This is what happened to Barley. The dog was exposed to sustained, overwhelming evidence of death and decay. Its animal brain, unable to process or rationalize the horror, adapted in the only way available, by recategorizing human remains as food. Once that cognitive leap occurred, the dog's behavior became increasingly oriented around this new understanding. The fact that Barley eventually began attacking the living, the Murphy children, Owen Driscoll, represents the final stage of moral collapse. The dog could no longer distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate food sources. Everything had become potential prey. Human observers at the time struggled to articulate what they found most disturbing about Barley's transformation. Many focused on the physical horror, the consumption of human flesh. But contemporary accounts that mention the dog consistently note something else: the change in the animal's eyes, the loss of recognition, the sense that the essential nature of the creature had been evacuated. This touches on a deeper fear, that exposure to sufficient horror can fundamentally change not just behavior but identity itself. The case raised questions that extended beyond Skibbereen. In the aftermath, several other incidents of domestic animals attacking the dead or dying were reported from famine-affected areas. In County Mayo, a farmer's sheepdog allegedly killed 2 children in March 1847. In Galway, pigs that had been feeding on improperly buried corpses were destroyed after attacking a living person. These incidents, combined with the Barley case, led to the first veterinary guidelines about animal behavior in disaster zones. By 1848, Relief organizations were actively discouraged from bringing domestic animals into areas of mass mortality. The British Veterinary Association published a brief paper in 1849 titled On the Psychological Effects of Sustained Exposure to Human Mortality in Domestic Animals. While primitive by modern standards, it represented the first systematic attempt to understand trauma responses in animals. The paper noted, domesticated animals, particularly those breeds selected for intelligence and sensitivity, demonstrate capacity for psychological injury when exposed to circumstances beyond their comprehension. The case of the Skibbereen retriever provides unfortunate evidence that animals may develop disordered behaviors when the normal order of life and death is disrupted on a massive scale. Modern veterinary psychology would recognize Barley's behavior as a combination of factors: traumatic stress, conditioned feeding response, and possibly neurological changes resulting from malnutrition, if the dog's refusal to eat normal food led to vitamin deficiencies that affected brain function. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the Barley case is what it reveals about how we construct narratives around trauma. William Forster needed to believe that Barley's transformation meant something. In his later journal entries, he searches desperately for theological or philosophical meaning in what happened. Was the dog being punished for his owner's sins? Was this God's judgment on the relief effort? Was Barley's madness a mirror reflecting the madness of the policies that created the famine? None of these explanations satisfied him because the truth was more mundane and somehow more terrible. Sometimes exposure to horror simply breaks things, breaks them beyond repair or redemption. And there is no deeper meaning, only the fact of the breaking itself. The Skibbereen community dealt with the trauma of the Barley incident by incorporating it into the larger narrative of famine suffering. The dog became another victim, another casualty of the Great Hunger. This framing allowed people to process what happened without having to dwell on the specific horror of children being killed by an animal that was supposed to represent British civilization and charity. For Forster personally, there was no such comfortable narrative. He spent the rest of his life grappling with the guilt of having brought Barley to Ireland, and with the larger question of whether charitable intervention in the midst of systematic oppression was meaningful or merely performative. In 1869, 23 years after the Skibbereen incident, Forster wrote a letter to a fellow Quaker who was preparing to do relief work in India during a famine there. The letter, preserved in the Friends Library, includes this passage: "You ask me for advice about your work in India. I can offer only this. Do not bring symbols of your civilization into places where that civilization has created catastrophe. Do not bring things you love into places of death, for death will corrupt them. Do not imagine that your goodness or the goodness of your intentions can protect you, or those dear to you, from the consequences of bearing witness to systematic horror. And above all, do not assume that you will return unchanged. If you are fortunate, you will be broken in ways that you can eventually understand. If you are less fortunate, you will be broken in ways that defy understanding entirely." The case of Barley the retriever has been largely forgotten, buried in obscure historical records and private journals. It receives no mention in most histories of the Great Famine, which tend to focus on the human toll and the political causes. But for those who study the psychological impacts of mass disaster, Barley's story offers a stark lesson. Trauma is not limited to humans. Suffering has no clear boundaries, and the ripple effects of catastrophe extend far beyond what we can easily measure or comprehend. In the end, a dog brought to Ireland to comfort dying children became instead another victim of the hunger, another casualty of the policies that turned crop failure into genocide. Another piece of evidence that exposure to sufficient horror transforms everything it touches. The golden retriever that William Forster brought to Skibbereen in December 1846, and the creature that was beaten to death in the Murphy cottage on January 4, 1847, were, in every meaningful sense, two different animals. The transformation between them is the real story. And it's a story about what happens when we bring innocence into places where innocence cannot survive. What do you think drove Barley to such acts? Was it simply animal instinct responding to unprecedented exposure to death? Or was there something deeper, a psychological breaking that mirrors what happens to humans in extreme circumstances? Leave your theories in the comments below. This is one of the most complex and disturbing historical cases we've covered, and we want to hear your perspectives. If you found this story as haunting as we did during our research, make sure you're subscribed to The Silent Abbey. We bring you the darkest, most forgotten chapters of history every week. Stories that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature and the consequences of catastrophe. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. And remember, the most terrifying stories from history are often the ones that have been deliberately forgotten. We're here to bring them back into the light. Until next time, stay curious about the darkness that history tries to hide. See you in the next video.